The mountain cooled, the sky cleared, and across all Middle-earth a silence deeper than any battle's end settled, like sacred breath over field and forest, city and wasteland alike. This was not the quiet of exhaustion or relief, but something far more profound, the hushed stillness of a world discovering what it meant to exist without the weight of absolute malice pressing upon every living thing. For over 1,000 years, the ring's influence had been the dark constant around which all other forces arranged themselves, the hidden gravity that bent every choice toward shadow or resistance. Now, in the space of a heartbeat, that fundamental pressure had simply vanished, leaving behind not celebration, but bewilderment, as if the very air had forgotten how to move without opposition. When the one unraveled, a lattice of compulsion dissolved across leagues, and commanders felt invisible reins slip softly from their exhausted hands, like released bowstrings. Orcish bands, deprived of their borrowed alignment, suddenly faltered into quarrel and flight, as if their singular purpose had drained through cracks in time itself. Far towers, once coordinated by a will like iron weather, grew blind overnight. The Palantiri now reflected only their keepers unless asked with gentler discipline than force. In the air above, the Nazgul were absent not merely by destruction, but by principle, because fear without a master declines into scattered rumor, powerless and directionless. The very quality of sunlight seemed different, no longer filtered through the perpetual haze of distant furnaces, but falling clean and bright on faces grown accustomed to shadow. Among the living, the first consequence was a tenderness edged with fatigue, because survival now meant making choices rather than obeying the simple necessity of resistance. Some wept for battles they had trained to meet, yet those drills could not teach the patient art of planting ordinary days in peaceful soil. Veterans counted names instead of enemies, while healers reordered supplies for mending rather than triage, discovering that peace required different skills than war had demanded. The great unmaking had created as many questions as it had answered, and those who survived would learn that victory's true challenge lay not in conquest's moment, but in the long, quiet work of choosing what would grow in the space cleared by destruction. In a guarded court, a sapling waited with ancient patience, its promise of renewal still requiring careful tending rather than mere hope. Near a round door, the red book lay open with empty pages, inviting the disciplined remembrance that would become governance through story and careful accounting. On the western margin, shipwrights paused before seasoned timbers, listening for the sea's counsel about departures not yet understood, while the straight road stretched toward harbors, where time felt thinner and purposes clearer. Now that the world was unbound from singular malice, someone must choose what would replace it, and by what authority such choices could be made without repeating the arrogance recently dispersed. The questions raised by victory's aftermath found their first answer, not in celebration, but in ceremony, as the returned king accepted a crown that bound him to covenant rather than conquest. Aragorn's coronation in Minas Tirith marked the Fourth Age's true beginning, not with dominion asserted, but with stewardship embraced, where royal authority would be measured by the healing it enabled rather than the fear it inspired. This was legitimacy earned through service, constrained by memory, and dedicated to the patient work of binding scattered peoples into a realm that could sustain peace without requiring perpetual vigilance against external malice. The mechanisms of restored kingship required delicate reconstruction, because a kingdom fragmented for centuries could not simply resume where ancient annals had ended their accounting. Northern rangers who had kept hidden watch over empty roads now swore public oaths, their secret vigil transformed into visible office through ceremonies honoring both past sacrifice and future responsibility. Southern lords, long accustomed to holding their own council, found themselves invited to councils where old grievances received acknowledgment before new alliances could take root in fertile ground. The stewards' faithful centuries were rewarded not with dismissal, but with honored partnership, their accumulated wisdom woven into governance that valued continuity alongside necessary change. Authority in this new age operated through invitation rather than compulsion, establishing law through patient example rather than immediate decree. The houses of healing became laboratories of sovereignty, where the king's hands restored health and justice followed medicine toward gentler order that could endure beyond any single reign. Ancient charters were reviewed with care, archaic penalties set aside, and borders redrawn to favor honest commerce over fortress pride that had characterized the long years of division. A palantir was handled with earned caution, its site employed for communication rather than domination, serving counsel instead of feeding the dangerous pride that had corrupted earlier wielders of such tools. The costs appeared immediately in burdens both intimate and institutional. Pressing upon a royal household that discovered triumph reorganized every private hour into patterns of audience, arbitration, and measured diplomacy. Letters carried apologies to former enemies, while translators built bridges of shared terminology, where grievances might otherwise ferment into future conflicts requiring military resolution. The White Tree's sapling, planted with ceremony rather than magic, became living symbol of constrained sovereignty, growth that could be tended but never commanded, beauty that would flourish only through seasons of diligent attention, rather than moments of spectacular intervention. From the citadel, messengers carried word that Annúminas would be rebuilt, not as monument to vanished glory, but as living city where the crown's northern seat could shelter ordinary families alongside royal ceremony. The reunited kingdom would stretch from Fornost to the southern fiefs, its strength measured by the safety of roads traveled by merchants and pilgrims, rather than the fear inspired in distant courts. Yet even as mortal authority found secure footing through oath and ordinance, deeper currents were shifting in the world's hidden architecture, where ancient powers faced their own reckoning with the ring's absence and time's resumed dominion. While mortal authority found its footing through oath and ceremony, deeper currents stirred in the world's hidden architecture, where ancient preservers felt time resume its patient, inexorable claim upon realms long held in suspension. The destruction of the One Ring had severed not merely the bonds of tyranny, but the intricate framework that sustained the three rings of the elves, whose quiet influence had kept certain havens bright and hours gentle beneath veils of translucent enchantment. This was the profound melancholy of interdependence revealed. The very power they had resisted was also the foundation that enabled their preservation. And with its unmaking, their own dominion began its graceful withdrawal from Middle-earth's affairs. The mechanism of fading operated through cosmic exhaustion rather than catastrophic failure, as if stones and trees held beyond their natural span were finally permitted to remember their true age with quiet dignity. In Rivendell, walls ceased their whispered counsel of accumulated ages, while gardens bloomed and withered according to weather, rather than the careful will of their immortal tenders. Lothlorien's golden Malorn trees held their unearthly radiance through one final season, a farewell gift to those who had loved them, before accepting autumn's honest claim and the cycle of renewal that no art could indefinitely postpone through even the most devoted stewardship. Elrond and Galadriel, keepers of Vilya and Nenya, experienced this transformation as a gradual lightening of burdens carried across millennia, the constant vigilance required to maintain their realm's protection, the delicate balance of preservation without stagnation, the isolation of watching mortal generations pass like brief seasons, while their own responsibilities remained timelessly unchanged. The rings had granted power to heal and preserve, but that power had exacted the price of separation from the world's natural rhythms, holding their bearers in states of beautiful exile from the very changes their guardianship enabled others to experience freely. As their influence waned, these ancient stewards discovered their deepest calling was not resistance, but shepherding the transformation with grace, ensuring the transition from preserved sanctuaries to living communities occurred without abandoning wisdom accumulated through their patient centuries of service. Libraries were organized for mortal scholars, healing lore transcribed for future physicians, and songs preserved in forms that human voices could sustain across generations without the aid of ring-enhanced memory or elven longevity that had once seemed essential for their faithful transmission. The Grey Havens assumed significance beyond mere harbor, becoming threshold where those whose work in Middle-earth was complete could take the straight road, no longer whispered legend, but actual craft practiced by shipwrights who understood departures as fulfillment rather than retreat. Sea-longing transformed from restless wanderlust into specific calling, a summons to shores where their diminished light might shine undimmed by mortal time's gentle tyranny over all created things. Yet before ships carried the ring-bearers westward, one small corner of Middle-earth awaited attention, where victory's challenges would manifest at the most intimate scale of hedge and furrow, hearth and harvest. While ancient powers prepared their graceful departures from Middle-earth's affairs, the smallest and most beloved corner of that world faced its own quiet reckoning with peace's unexpected domestic challenges. The Shire had been preserved not merely by distance from great events, but by deliberate policy, royal edicts ensuring that soldiers' boots would not disturb its lanes, while local governance valued the patient rhythms of seed time and harvest over the urgent mathematics of war. Yet even this protected realm discovered that victory created challenges requiring different virtues than resistance had demanded, and the hobbits who returned from distant adventures brought with them knowledge that their neighbors found both precious and unsettling in equal measure. The mechanism of protection operated through layers of careful invisibility, where the king's authority manifested not in visible presence, but in the absence of intrusion, borders patrolled by rangers whose discretion kept merchants and wanderers moving along prescribed routes without ever glimpsing the green hills beyond. Local offices maintained their ancient dignity through deliberate smallness, where mayors governed through feast and custom rather than decree, and the sheriff's gentle authority extended no further than ensuring that gates stayed mended and disputes received patient arbitration rather than hasty judgment from distant courts unfamiliar with hobbit ways. The bounders traced familiar boundaries with renewed purpose, while the Matham house received objects stripped of false importance, their stories catalogued so inheritance would enrich rather than burden future generations with the weight of unexamined legacy. The scouring had taught bitter lessons about vulnerability, disguised as safety, revealing how quickly ordered life could fragment when malice found purchase among neighbors who had forgotten the price of their protected peace. The restoration that followed required not merely rebuilding damaged mills and replanting torn gardens, but cultivating the delicate balance between openness and preparedness that would preserve hobbit virtues without repeating hobbit blindness to the world's darker possibilities. An unease still stirred at the sound of loud footsteps on unfamiliar paths, and a preference for well-worn roads over new ventures spoke of scars not yet fully faded from the collective heart of the community. In this work of reconstruction, the Red Book assumed significance beyond personal memoir, becoming institutional memory where the costs of great events received honest accounting alongside their glorious outcomes through Sam's careful records and Frodo's more troubled reflections. The Malorn tree, grown from Galadriel's gift, stood as living reminder that some blessings carried obligations extending far beyond their immediate recipients' lifetimes, its golden leaves teaching a philosophy of protection through grace rather than through walls or prohibitions that might diminish the very qualities they sought to preserve. If small realms could be kept safe through royal promise and local wisdom, could distant borders learn similar arts of self-preservation without requiring constant intervention from crowned authority? And could former enemies discover the patient work of reconciliation? The question of protection extending beyond protected borders led the restored king toward territories where maps had long been shaded with the simple designation of enemy, requiring no consideration beyond military preparedness and defensive vigilance. Here, among peoples whose names had appeared in Gondorian chronicles only as threats to be contained or defeated, Aragorn undertook the most delicate work of his reign, transforming foes into neighbors through the patient arithmetic of honor offered and received. This was statecraft as moral pivot, requiring rituals of recognition that acknowledged shared humanity beneath the accumulated grievances of generations raised to consider each other as natural adversaries rather than potential partners, separated by circumstance and conflicting loyalties imposed by distant malice. The mechanisms of reconciliation operated through careful exchanges that balanced vulnerability with dignity, where former enemies discovered their mutual interest in stable borders and honest commerce rather than the exhausting vigilance that perpetual hostility demanded from both sides. Hostages became guests in arrangements that honored families while ensuring good faith, their treatment serving as visible proof that mercy extended beyond mere conquest toward genuine partnership in building futures neither side could achieve through continued opposition. Tribute transformed into trade agreements that recognized southern peoples' skills in metalwork and animal husbandry, while Gondorian engineers shared knowledge of irrigation and fortification in exchanges that strengthened both realms against wilderness rather than against each other's territorial ambitions. Veterans on both sides carried the heaviest burden of this transformation, their memories of fallen comrades requiring patient reconciliation, with policies that now asked them to shake hands with men who had once carried black banners across familiar battlefields where friends had died. The king's own example became essential teaching, as he received former enemies in halls where their fathers might have been executed as traitors, demonstrating through personal risk that peace required courage different from but equal to the bravery that warfare had demanded from previous generations of soldiers and commanders. Amnesties were offered to those who could prove coercion rather than zealotry in their past service, while translators and scribes worked to establish shared terminology for concepts like justice and honor that had developed differently in separated cultures shaped by centuries of mutual suspicion. The Palantir of Minas Tirith found new purpose in this work, its site employed not for surveillance, but for communication across distances that had once seemed unbridgeable, allowing personal relationships with southern lords whose cooperation depended more on trust than treaty language written by distant diplomats. Single oaths kept on dusty roads between scattered settlements prevented raids that might have escalated into renewed warfare, while Mercy's patient calculus demonstrated that northern concessions could strengthen rather than weaken Gondor's position by transforming defensive expenses into productive investments in regional stability and mutual prosperity. Yet treaties could broaden realms, but damaged land required different healing, and across the river, a prince had already begun that gentler work among terraces, where war's scars ran deeper than politics could mend. While treaties addressed the wounds between peoples, damaged landscapes required different healing. And across the river in Ithilien, Prince Faramir and Princess Éowyn discovered that governance could become gardening through patient attention to soil and season rather than decree and ceremony. This wounded province, long contested between realm and shadow, had suffered not merely from battles, but from neglect. Terraces abandoned to bramble, orchards grown wild, streams diverted by military necessity, rather than agricultural wisdom that honored the land's natural rhythms. Here, restoration became philosophy, enacted through policy, demonstrating that landscapes remember the quality of hands that tend them, and that authority could be botanical when rulers understood their role as stewardship of living systems, rather than dominion over static territories carved by ancient boundaries. The mechanisms of green governance operated through deliberate patience that resisted grand monuments in favor of incremental improvements, compounding across seasons into lasting abundance measured in decades rather than dramatic gestures. Reforestation proceeded according to careful plans, considering watershed protection alongside timber yields, while roads were rerouted to follow natural contours rather than forcing straight lines that convenience preferred. But erosion would eventually punish through costly repairs. Ranger companies, their military vigilance no longer required against external threats, retrained as orchard wardens whose knowledge of hidden paths now served cultivation rather than concealment. Their woodcraft applied to nurturing growth rather than tracking enemies through terrain transformed by peacetime possibilities into productive farmland. The costs appeared in discipline required to resist spectacular projects in favor of work whose benefits would mature slowly, visible only to those who measured success through patient observation rather than immediate acclaim from visiting dignitaries. Ruined towers remained ruins by conscious choice, their stones quarried for mill foundations, rather than rebuilt as monuments to vanished conflicts whose commemoration might inspire renewed hostilities among neighbors learning to trust each other. This was governance through humility, accepting that healing required time and could not be accelerated by royal decree, no matter how well-intentioned such interventions might appear to those accustomed to measuring progress through visible construction projects. Athelas, once reserved for battlefield emergencies, became civic herb cultivated in gardens where its properties served ordinary ailments rather than dramatic crises, while white tree seedlings were planted as practical shade for market squares, where children could learn patience through watching growth occur at nature's measured pace. The princess brought northern understanding of weather and horses to complement her husband's southern knowledge of stone and water, their partnership at Emin Arnon demonstrating that restoration flourished through combining different traditions, rather than imposing uniform solutions across diverse terrain, requiring local wisdom guided by central principles. If gardens represented governance above ground, creating abundance through patient tending, what of the ancient craft that worked below, where different peoples had learned to make beauty from stone and bring forth light from darkness? While gardens above ground taught governance through patient seasons, beneath the earth in Aglaron's crystalline chambers, ancient craft discovered new purpose as Gimli. The dwarf transformed making from solitary accumulation into generous reconciliation between peoples long divided by suspicion and pride. The glittering caves had suffered violation during the war, their natural splendor stained by occupation that required more than cleaning. They needed restoration through reverent labor that could heal spaces of defilement back into sanctuaries worthy of their inherent beauty. This was craft as covenant, stone set not for personal glory, but as apology made visible, demonstrating that dwarven excellence could serve friendship rather than the jealous isolation that had characterized mountain kingdoms during centuries when different races regarded each other across unbridgeable chasms of cultural mistrust. The mechanisms of transformed making appeared in guild charters that bound artisans to royal commissions serving common good, their traditional secrecy replaced by teaching exchanges where dwarven masters shared techniques with human stonemasons, whose combined skills created beauty neither tradition could achieve through solitary effort. City gates were remade not as defensive barriers, but as welcoming thresholds, their carvings celebrating peace rather than intimidating enemies, while bridges spanned rivers with arches designed to honor water's natural flow rather than merely conquering distance through engineering that ignored grace for efficiency. Mithril, once jealously guarded in mountain vaults, found diplomatic purpose in gifts that sealed alliances through shared appreciation of beauty rather than demonstrations of wealth or military advantage that might inspire envy instead of friendship. The costs pressed heavily upon genealogies grown thin, where ancient bloodlines faced the lonely mathematics of dwindling numbers and the choice between preserving traditional isolation or founding colonies far from ancestral halls where young dwarves might marry and raise families rather than remaining celibate guardians of gradually emptying kingdoms whose echoes grew more hollow with each passing generation. Excellence required heirs, but training worthy successors demanded time that aging masters possessed in decreasing measure, creating pressure to choose between maintaining exacting standards and ensuring continuity of knowledge that might otherwise vanish with its keepers into unmarked graves beneath stone that remembered everything except the names of those who shaped it. The mirrored lake of Aglarond reflected not dwarven pride, but covenant between dwarf lord and human king, its still surface holding the memory of oaths taken after battle, that valor would henceforth protect flourishing rather than conquest. Mithril bright thresholds promised protection through beauty rather than imprisonment behind walls, their gleam welcoming honest visitors while deterring those who approached with malicious intent through the simple dignity of craft that honored rather than intimidated. Gimli's unprecedented friendship with Legolas became living template for cooperation between mountain and forest, stone and leaf, traditions that had developed in separation learning to strengthen each other through generous exchange rather than competition for scarce resources. Yet generous craft was creating bonds that would soon face their own test, as partnerships reached toward departures honoring friendship through separation, and harbors called to those whose work in Middle-earth approached its destined completion. The bonds forged through generous craft would soon face their ultimate test at Western Keys, where time felt thinner and ancient shipwrights practiced arts older than kingdoms in service of departures that honored completion rather than abandonment. The Grey Havens operated according to principles that transcended ordinary harbor commerce, their builders understanding that certain vessels must be crafted for journeys beyond the world's curve, carrying passengers whose calling outlasted their earthly context toward shores where diminished light could shine undimmed by mortal time's gentle tyranny over all created things. This was departure as ritual mercy, the straight road made manifest through timber seasoned by star lore and shaped by hands trained in silence, their work enabling others to leave with dignity when their tasks in Middle-earth reached their appointed conclusion through service rather than failure. The mechanisms of this sacred craft required knowledge passed master to master through demonstration rather than written instruction, because the skills involved touched mysteries that words could not contain without diminishing their essential nature through premature explanation to those unprepared for such responsibilities. Timber was chosen under starlight by readers of seasons who knew which groves offered planks that would not quarrel with the sea's deeper currents, while keels were laid upon markings aligned to constellations remembered from before the world was bent into its current shape. Sailors trained in disciplines of silence learned to read weather patterns that existed between ordinary seasons, their expertise enabling passage through waters that reflected stars from skies beyond the dome of night, where different constellations guided travelers toward destinations unmarked on any chart accessible to mortal cartographers seeking familiar landmarks. The costs appeared in communities designed to diminish themselves through success. their purpose fulfilled when their services were no longer required by those who had completed their work in lands growing daily more suited to human stewardship rather than immortal preservation through arts that required constant vigilance. Shipwrights accepted the melancholy arithmetic of their vocation, measuring achievement through enabling others to depart, rather than accumulating vessels in harbors where they might serve repeated voyages to familiar destinations that offered comfort rather than completion. Farewells left aftersound in halls where voices grew fewer with each tide, while workshops trained apprentices who understood their craft's ultimate goal was its own ending when the last ship carried the final passengers toward shores that called to those whose labors had earned rest beyond the circles of the world. The straight road remained a modest miracle of alignment rather than force, revealing its plane only to hulls prepared through right measure and mercy, rather than demanding passage through conquest or magical compulsion that violated natural law. Here, not only high lords would eventually take passage, a certain gardener with his precious burden of memory would follow this path, carrying pages that had taught him to measure days by gratitude rather than dread, accompanied by unlikely companion whose friendship had transcended traditional boundaries between different kindreds through generous understanding. While some prepared to honor departure's call, others committed themselves to staying, accepting the work of keeping peace along roads where fear had once traveled, with every merchant seeking safe passage. While some prepared to honor departure's call through western harbors, others committed themselves to the patient work of staying, transforming hidden vigilance into visible service as the rangers of the north stepped from shadow into daylight, under oaths that bound wandering duty to lawful office. These men had spent generations as watchers between worlds, their culture shaped by the discipline of protecting people who never knew their names, maintaining borders that existed more in faithful memory than on maps drawn by those who governed through ceremony, rather than through the lonely arithmetic of preventing disasters that never occurred. Now they faced transformation as profound as any wrought by the ring's destruction, discovering whether their essential virtues could survive the transition from mystery into institution without losing the qualities that had made their protection effective across centuries when no king sat in foremost. The mechanisms of this change required delicate balance between honoring continuity and embracing necessary evolution, where oaths sworn to living crown replaced abstract loyalty that had sustained them through generations of service to bloodlines remembered rather than authority exercised through visible presence. Patrols once designed for concealment reformed as circuits of aid, their knowledge of hidden paths now serving merchants and pilgrims who could acknowledge their guardians without compromising the safety that secrecy had once provided through careful invisibility. Wayhouses replaced secret caches along the Greenway, offering rest to drovers and pilgrims under protection that no longer required explanation, while ruins long surveyed for strategic advantage were reassessed for restoration potential, their stones counted for building rather than fortification against enemies who would never again threaten these recovering lands. The costs pressed upon identity itself, as men defined by wandering learned the challenge of establishing residency without abandoning the mobility that had made their protections comprehensive rather than localized to particular settlements or familiar territories. A culture that had prized anonymity, as professional virtue, now faced teaching skills without losing essential discretion that prevented such knowledge from being misused by those who might learn techniques, without understanding the responsibilities that constrained their proper application through generations of earned wisdom. The loneliness that had been their sacrifice became resource requiring careful management, their comfort with solitude enabling them to serve as bridges between scattered communities grown accustomed to isolation during years when travel carried risks only the desperate accepted. Anuminas represented promise awaiting fulfillment, stone foundations surveyed for a northern seat where the crown's authority could shelter ordinary families alongside royal ceremony, while the Anor stone found disciplined employment as tool of coordination rather than surveillance, its sight-serving counsel across distances without the temptation toward omniscience that had corrupted previous wielders. Mile markers rose along restored roads, their inscriptions honest about distances and destinations, signaling governance interested in reliable passage rather than theatrical displays of dominion that might intimidate rather than welcome honest travelers seeking safe commerce. Yet even as northern borders learned visible protection's patient arts, one territory remained where different governance was required, land once defended by fear alone, where mercy would face its greatest test among ashes that remembered only slavery and the bitter harvest of absolute malice. Where northern governance learned to operate through visible protection and patient service, the eastern wastes presented mercy's most demanding test in lands where ground itself remembered slavery, and sky bore witness to generations of suffering under tyranny that had poisoned both soil and spirit through systematic degradation spanning millennia. Mordor's aftermath required different wisdom than restoration elsewhere, because here the task was not rebuilding what had been destroyed, but inventing institutions from nothing, creating order where only compulsion had existed, and discovering whether peoples shaped by absolute subjugation could learn the patient arts of self-governance when their masters simply vanished without leaving any framework for the freedom that survival had suddenly thrust upon them through victory's unexpected mercy. The mechanisms of liberation operated through careful manumission that recognized former slaves as subjects rather than spoils, their legal status established through royal decree, backed by detailed rolls and seals that granted citizenship alongside responsibility for choices they had never been permitted to make during lifetimes spent obeying commands issued without explanation or appeal. Field redistribution around the dark inland sea of Nirn proceeded according to principles that favored small holdings over efficient estates, accepting lower yields in exchange for stability that came from people working land they owned rather than territory assigned for cultivation under supervision that might easily revert to exploitation if economic pressures overwhelmed moral commitments made in victory's generous aftermath. Wardens settled among these new communities served as keepers rather than conquerors of fragile order, their authority constrained by written law, and their success measured through the gradual emergence of local leadership that could eventually assume full responsibility for governance without external oversight or intervention from distant capitals whose understanding of local conditions remained necessarily limited. Soil contaminated by industrial malice required patient remediation, spanning decades before supporting crops capable of feeding families rather than merely preventing starvation, while deep-rooted grasses drew metals upward and charcoal bound toxins within furrows through rotations that balanced immediate need with long-term restoration of fertility, stolen by generations of exploitative agriculture. The costs appeared in problems that chroniclers treated with careful discretion, acknowledging that not every consequence of absolute evil could be remedied through good intentions or royal proclamation, no matter how sincerely offered by those who had never experienced such systematic degradation of human dignity. Some territories remained empty by necessity rather than choice, their desolation serving as honest reminder that certain wounds must heal slowly rather than being forced toward premature closure through interventions that might worsen damage they sought to repair through impatient benevolence. In Nirn, Athalas found its truest metaphor as healing that soothes pain more effectively than erasing damage, acknowledging that some scars resist remedy, save time's slow ministration across generations willing to attempt what had never been tried before in Middle-earth's long history. If poisoned lands could receive pardon and scattered peoples learn reconciliation, what price did love exact when immortal chose mortality? And how could kingdoms learn the art of honorable endings? While poisoned lands received pardons measured in decades, and scattered peoples learned reconciliation through patient institutions, the Fourth Age's most profound covenant was written not in law but in love's quiet arithmetic, where an immortal queen chose mortality to teach an entire kingdom how to measure days through gratitude rather than dread. Arwen Undomiel's decision to accept the gift of men represented more than personal sacrifice. It became the philosophical foundation upon which the reunited realm would learn to govern itself as stewardship rather than eternal dominion, understanding that authority gained meaning through its willingness to pass gracefully to worthy successors, rather than clinging to power through desperate measures that corrupted the very virtues such power was meant to protect across generations. The mechanism of chosen mortality operated through deliberate acceptance of limits that immortal nature had never required her to acknowledge, each passing season now carrying weight that elven years had distributed across centuries too vast for mortal comprehension. Where once she had experienced time as endless resource available for patient contemplation, now each day demanded conscious choice about how to spend hours that would not return, creating urgency balanced by wisdom, accumulated through millennia, but tempered by newfound empathy for those whose entire existence unfolded within spans she had once considered brief intervals between more significant events requiring sustained attention. This transformation affected governance through example rather than decree, as the royal household demonstrated that even ancient wisdom could embrace change rather than clinging to familiar patterns that might become obstacles to growth if preserved beyond their proper season. Court ceremonies adapted to acknowledge cycles of renewal rather than eternal continuity, while succession planning became active preparation rather than distant theoretical consideration, ensuring that institutions could survive transitions between rulers without losing essential character or abandoning principles proven through practical application rather than mere traditional authority inherited from previous ages. The costs appeared most clearly in solitude that deepened with each departure of her people toward western shores, leaving her increasingly isolated among mortals who loved her, but could not share memories spanning millennia, or understand references to events that had occurred before their ancestors' births, creating loneliness different from any she had experienced during centuries when separation from beloved companions had been temporary rather than final. The Evan star at her throat became symbol of light, willingly dimmed rather than eternal radiance, preserved through withdrawal from the world's natural rhythms, its beauty now measured not by unchanging perfection, but by graceful participation in cycles of illumination and rest that characterized mortal experience. Her partnership with Aragorn evolved through shared recognition that their love had become model for an entire age, learning to find beauty in limitation, rather than seeking escape from constraints that gave meaning to choice and consequence through their irreversible nature. Together, they discovered that mortality's gift was not merely death's inevitability, but life's intensification, where each decision carried weight precisely because opportunities once missed could not be endlessly repeated, and where forgiveness gained urgency because time for reconciliation was finite rather than assumed to be always available for future consideration when pride had cooled. The white tree in the court of the fountain grew according to natural seasons rather than responding to royal will or magical preservation, its cycles teaching the city that even symbols of eternal authority must participate in the world's rhythm of growth and rest, flowering and dormancy, each phase beautiful in its proper time rather than demanding permanent spring that would exhaust both tree and soil through unnatural demands for continuous productivity without periods of necessary restoration that honored natural law. In quiet evening hours when court duties released them to private conversation, the royal couple shared understanding that their greatest legacy would be the kingdom's ability to continue flourishing after their deaths, having learned to find stability through adaptations rather than rigid preservation of forms that might become empty shells if maintained without regard for changing circumstances, requiring new applications of enduring principles, rather than depending on individual heroism to solve institutional challenges through personal intervention. Among the legacies of Númenor, one custom survived the ruin of kingdoms, the sovereign's right to choose the hour of departure, and Aragorn understood that a people long acquainted with clinging required counterexample of deliberate yielding, preparing his heir through shared audiences and long walks, where he named mistakes as freely as triumphs, demonstrating that succession is healthiest when accomplished by consent rather than compelled by collapse or crisis. The green hill at Cerin Amroth remained in memory as place where love had first acknowledged its willingness to accept time's constraints, transforming from sanctuary outside history into symbol of choice that honored both past and future, through present commitment to share whatever years remained, without counting them as insufficient or grudging fate for failing to provide eternity on terms that would deny the very conditions making devotion meaningful through voluntary acceptance of limitation. Yet if royal deaths could become good deaths, teaching rather than traumatizing their subjects, could memory itself serve as governance, and might stories prove as reliable as laws for preserving wisdom across generations that would inherit peace rather than create it through their own sacrifices and patient chronicling. While royal deaths could become teachings that strengthened rather than traumatized their subjects, the most enduring governance emerged not from throne or council chamber, but from a round study where careful hands transformed personal memoir into institutional wisdom. The Red Book of Westmarch evolved beyond chronicle into civic foundation, its patient accounting of costs alongside glorious outcomes, providing future generations with honest guidance about peace's price and the disciplines required to maintain what had been won through sacrifice rather than accident or divine intervention that could not be repeated when similar challenges arose. The mechanism of memory as governance operated through the revolutionary principle that power could be preserved by being shared rather than hoarded, where knowledge carefully recorded became more valuable than secrets jealously guarded by those who feared transparency might diminish their authority. Sam Gamgee's methodical chronicles transformed mayoral office from ceremonial position into practical stewardship, where feast days were planned with the same attention once reserved for military campaigns, and where letters traveled swiftly because trust accompanied them along roads maintained by communities, understanding their investment in reliable communication between scattered settlements, learning to see themselves as parts of larger patterns. This was governance through narrative rather than edict, where stories taught principles more effectively than laws could enforce behavior, because tales carried emotional weight that made abstract concepts concrete through examples of how real people had navigated moral challenges, similar to those facing each new generation, seeking guidance from predecessors who had faced comparable difficulties with limited resources but unlimited determination. The practice of chronicling became civic duty as essential as maintaining roads or organizing harvests, ensuring that wisdom earned through experience would not die with those who had paid its price through personal sacrifice and patient learning from mistakes that need not be repeated. The quick post revived as bloodstream of polite commonwealth, moving not merely invitations and announcements, but weather reports, seed exchanges, and careful warnings about roads softening under late rains, creating fabric of trust stronger than fear's braid through steady attention to detail that dignified ordinary life. In Michel Delving, the Matham House deepened its purpose, cataloguing heirlooms with notes on provenance and safe use, turning curiosity into curriculum for inheritance without quarrel, while young readers learned the difference between relic and tool, understanding that some objects existed for admiration while others must earn their keep. The costs of such devoted chronicling pressed upon those who undertook memory's responsibility with its full weight, particularly Sam, whose act of recording meant reliving moments of greatest peril and profoundest loss, knowing he could not be cured of his memories by staying beside his hearth. This was stewardship requiring quiet heroism that eschewed outward glory for meticulous work of truth-telling, admitting that keeping the tale was also letting go, acknowledging that the age of grand adventures was past, and his greatest contribution lay in ensuring its lessons were faithfully preserved. Copies of the Red Book traveled farther than gossip, reaching Minas Tirith through trusted couriers who carried not only pages, but the temperament that produced them, where librarians welcomed the manuscript as companion to annals of kings, appreciating its method more than its marvels, and imitating its habits quietly. Royal healers, reading recipes for Athelas brewed to soothe after long march, translated such care into hospitals that measured recovery by return to conversation rather than dramatic cures, while surveyors began walking with notebook rather than spear, because comprehensive maps require respect for goats as surely as gates. The Malorn tree's golden leaves provided practical benefit beyond symbolism, their unique properties making ink that resisted fading, even when exposed to damp conditions that destroyed ordinary writing, ensuring records maintained legibility across decades, when proper storage might not always be available to communities whose resources were devoted to immediate needs rather than archival preservation. This was stewardship operating through humble materials, elevated by careful attention to their proper use, where beauty served function rather than existing merely for ornamental display. Letters from the king arrived with increasing frequency as Aragorn aged, their contents revealing his adoption of chronicling practices that Sam's example had demonstrated could strengthen rather than burden administrative efficiency when properly integrated into existing routines rather than imposed as additional obligations. Royal correspondence began including detailed explanations of policy decisions alongside formal announcements, creating educational opportunities for local leaders, learning to understand how principles applied at different scales required modification without abandoning essential character, connecting immediate choices to larger purposes spanning generations. The round door of Bag End became threshold of inheritance as Sam prepared to pass both keys and responsibility to successors who would continue preserving memory through disciplined attention to truth rather than convenient fiction that might flatter contemporary sensibilities while failing to provide future generations with reliable guidance. His handwriting grew careful as years advanced, each entry shaped by awareness that future readers would depend upon clarity that could not be supplemented by personal explanation when questions arose about events whose significance might not become apparent until circumstances revealed connections invisible to contemporary observers. As sea longing stirred in the chronicler's heart, echoing the ancient call that had drawn his master westward, he prepared for his own departure, knowing the practice of memory would continue through others who understood that books could keep worlds when tended with proper reverence. Yet before such departures could be completed, older voices called from forest depths where time moved differently, and ancient guardians faced their own reckonings with the world's transformation toward human scale and mortal stewardship of lands once tended by beings whose patience exceeded kingdoms' lifespans. While chroniclers preserved wisdom through careful accounting and patient stewardship of inherited knowledge, older voices stirred among ancient roots where time moved according to seasons measured in centuries rather than years, calling to be heard once more before their long watch ended. The Ents had witnessed Middle-earth's passage through ages of stone and star, their patient guardianship extending over forests that remembered the first songs and valleys that had known the early conversations between growing things and those who tended them with reverence rather than exploitation. Yet now they faced changes more profound than any wrought by axe or fire. The gradual withdrawal of wonder itself from woodlands, learning to flourish under mortal stewardship rather than immortal protection sustained through vigilance spanning millennia. The mechanism of their transformation operated not through death, but through a deepening contemplation that drew them toward communion, so profound it resembled the sleep of mountains, where individual consciousness became diffused through root networks and canopy systems until personal identity merged with the collective memory of forests themselves. This was not failure, but fulfillment of their original purpose, as shepherds who had accepted responsibility for protecting growing things discovered their greatest service lay in teaching woods to tend themselves through natural processes that required no conscious intervention once proper patterns had been established through patient example, spanning generations of careful cultivation and wise restraint from interference that might disrupt delicate balances achieved through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Treebeard and his remaining companions found their thoughts turning increasingly toward the music that had called trees into consciousness during the world's youth, when ancient songs had awakened awareness in oak and ash, beech and birch, creating partnerships between shepherd and flock that had sustained forests through ages when darkness threatened to consume all growing things through malice that understood destruction, but not the patient arts of nurturing life. Now that such threats had passed, their role shifted from active protection toward passive witness, allowing younger growth to assume responsibility for continuation, while ancient guardians gradually merged with the landscapes they had served through devotion measured not in years, but in the slow accumulation of rings within heartwood that recorded seasons of drought and plenty with equal acceptance. The Entwives remained absent from chronicles that preferred certainty to speculation, their fate acknowledged with the restraint that honors mystery rather than demanding resolution, where evidence refuses to provide clear answers to questions that may transcend mortal understanding. Some among the Ents believed their lost companions had found different forms of stewardship, their essence perhaps dispersed through grain and root, flower and seed, continuing their work of nurturing growth through methods invisible to those who sought dramatic reunions rather than recognizing presence in the patient abundance that sustained communities, learning to feed themselves through harmony with natural cycles rather than conquest of resistant terrain. Where Ent paths had once been maintained through conscious effort, deer trails now served similar purposes, their routes chosen by instinct that honored the same principles of movement through landscape that shepherds had taught through example rather than formal instruction in techniques that could not be conveyed through words, but must be felt through seasons of careful observation. Groves that had received direct protection learned to defend themselves through root networks and canopy cooperation that distributed resources according to need rather than competition, while clearings maintained their openness through grazing patterns that prevented encroachment without requiring intervention from guardians whose attention had turned toward deeper contemplations, spanning decades between thoughts expressed through rustling leaves rather than spoken syllables. The inheritance of their wisdom operated through mood rather than mandate, where human foresters began walking with patience, learned from trees rather than urgency, driven by immediate need, their harvesting guided by principles absorbed through proximity to ancient understanding, rather than formal instruction in methods that required intuition, developed through respectful partnership with living systems. Royal decrees protected groves not through designation as monuments, but through acknowledgement that some places existed for purposes beyond human comprehension, their value measured through the peace they offered to those who approached with appropriate reverence, rather than the resources they might provide if subjected to exploitation that ignored their deeper significance. Songs persisted in villages where children learned melodies without understanding their origins, their voices carrying fragments of conversations between shepherd and tree, gardener and grain, maintaining connections to older partnerships through music that preserved relationships even when their historical context faded from conscious memory, ensuring continuity achieved through transformation rather than attempting to preserve forms whose time had passed, with the departure of those who had given them meaning through personal presence and devoted attention spanning ages of patient service. In Fangorn's deepest valleys, where streams ran clear and shadows fell soft, preparations began for the final conversations between beings whose friendship had transcended boundaries between different kindreds, their bond preparing for separations that would honor connections forged across centuries rather than attempting to preserve them, beyond their natural conclusion through desperate measures that might diminish rather than celebrate what had been achieved through patient understanding between dwarf and elf, mountain and forest, stone and leaf learning to strengthen each other, through generous exchange rather than competition for dominance over shared territories that belonged ultimately to neither tradition alone, if the world was finally meant for mortal stewardship. What became of those who stayed not for fate or duty, but for friendship deeper than custom? And how would they honor bonds that had no precedent in earlier ages, through departures that celebrated rather than severed what they had built together across the long years of growing trust and mutual respect? While ancient guardians withdrew into contemplative silence and friendship prepared its dignified farewells, the Western Keys gathered the final bright threads of the Third Age into vessels shaped for mercy rather than conquest or commerce. The Grey Havens had become threshold where time leaned thinner, not to erase the world they loved, but to honor completions achieved through patient service rather than dramatic gesture, acknowledging that certain labors, once finished, deserved rest beyond the reach of rumor and recurring summons that might disturb earned peace. Here the straight road revealed itself as gift rather than right, its hidden plane accessible only to those who approached with proper preparation, through service rather than demanding passage through conquests or magical compulsion that violated the natural laws governing transitions between different states of being in Middle-earth's carefully ordered cosmos. The mechanisms of these sacred departures operated through permissions granted by royal authority that recognized when service had reached its natural conclusion, where the king's wisdom manifested in offering passage to those whose calling led beyond the circles of the world toward destinations unmarked on any chart accessible to ordinary navigation or mortal understanding. Ships were built according to specifications older than kingdoms, by guilds whose expertise enabled voyages that honored completion rather than representing flight from responsibilities left unfulfilled. their hulls crafted from timber chosen under starlight, by readers of seasons who understood which groves offered planks that would not quarrel with deeper currents flowing between worlds through waters that reflected stars from skies beyond the dome of night, where different constellations guided travelers toward shores unmarked by any mortal cartographer. Elrond and Galadriel, keepers of Vilya and Nenya, found their departure eased by evidence that their teachings had taken root among students who would continue nurturing wisdom planted during millennia of patient instruction, offered without expectation of immediate comprehension from those who benefited from protection they rarely recognized or acknowledged. Frodo Baggins accompanied them, bearing invisible scars that Middle-earth could not heal despite all skill and kindness, his passage westward becoming teaching about mercies, recognition that healing sometimes required distance from scenes that could not be viewed without pain, allowing recovery to occur in places where memory could be transformed from wound into wisdom through processes unavailable in lands where every familiar sight carried echoes of trauma that resisted ordinary remedies applied with even the most devoted attention. Years later, Legolas felt sea-longing sharpen into specific vocation, not as flight from duty, but as acceptance that his work among mortals stood complete, building a vessel from white planks that carried the scent of mountain wind and green shadows, its keel tuned to music he had followed since the world shook off its captive sorrow and learned to sing again. The unprecedented invitation extended to Gimli expressed more than personal affection. It was recognition that friendship could alter permissions otherwise traced by kindred alone, where bonds forged through shared wonder at beauty transcended traditional boundaries between peoples whose separation had been maintained through misunderstanding rather than essential incompatibility that could not be overcome through generous attention to common ground existing beneath surface differences that had once seemed insurmountable. Samwise Gamgee's eventual journey followed different timing, but similar logic, his departure occurring only after his chronicling had established foundations strong enough to support memory's preservation through successors who understood their inheritance as responsibility rather than privilege, ensuring continuity of witness that would keep faith with those who had paid peace's price through personal sacrifice rather than abstract principle or heroic gesture unconnected to daily life. The mayor's pack contained pages that had taught him to measure days by gratitude rather than dread, their careful accounting of costs alongside glorious outcomes, providing future generations with honest guidance about the disciplines required to maintain what had been won through patience rather than force, wisdom rather than mere courage applied without understanding of consequences extending beyond immediate crisis or dramatic resolution. Behind these departures, Middle-earth discovered its capacity for flourishing under mortal guidance, informed by immortal wisdom, but not dependent upon constant intervention from those whose time had passed with the completion of tasks that had defined their purpose during ages when such work seemed essential for survival itself. The white tree grew according to natural seasons in courts, where children learned patience through watching growth occur at nature's measured pace, while the Red Book's influence spread through copies that carried not only events, but the temperament that had recorded them. With honest attention to truth rather than convenient fiction, designed to flatter contemporary sensibilities, while failing to provide reliable guidance for future challenges requiring similar virtues applied to different circumstances. Thus, the guiding question found its resolution in the quiet arithmetic of transformation, where Middle-earth was changed not by single dramatic intervention, but by the patient mechanisms of covenant and consent, craft and careful stewardship, demonstrating that victory's true meaning emerged not in conquest's moment, but in the generations that followed, learning to live with grace among the ruins of legend, and the enduring architecture of peace built through countless small choices made by ordinary people committed to preserving what had been won through extraordinary sacrifice by those who had earned their rest beyond the circles of the world, leaving behind a realm finally prepared for the patient work of human stewardship, guided by wisdom, but not constrained by the presence of those who had taught such lessons through their own devoted example across the long years of growing trust.